it seemed like 3 decades of incredible collaboration with China and the West and America specifically, and just look at what happened with the iPhone and the number of people who rose out of poverty in China. And it seemed to be going really well. And it seemed like the NBA was playing games there and we were sending movies there. Everything seemed to be on the right track. And then something seems to have gone horribly wrong. And a 2-part question, what has gone horribly wrong? Why has this happened so quickly? Because it seems like it's changed since COVID in such a rapid fashion that's caught us all by surprise, how this has come apart. And what does China want that we don't seem to understand?
Okay, 2 great questions, and I'll try to be brief. So maybe in your world, the better way to think of it is to have an established, entrenched a company and a disruptive upstart.
Got it.
When the disruptive upstart is 1% of the business, welcome. 5% of the business, welcome. 10% of the business. Now it's moving faster and more rapidly. All of a sudden, one begins to think, wait a minute, where is this going? Could it actually imagine it will displace me? So China was, at the beginning of the century, 10% of the US GDP. Today, it's 3/4 of the US GDP. So it's quite plausible that China will have a larger GDP, even by market exchange rates, than the US. Well, wait a minute, we're number 1. That's part of who we are. So in a Thucydidean dynamic, basically the seesaw of power begins to shift. Think of a seesaw on a kid's playground. The guy with the bulk is on one end, the little guy's on the other, and he begins bulking up. All of a sudden, the seesaw begins moving. The dynamics of that is Thucydides' trap. So the perception changes. I used to look down on you. Now I'm having to look you in the eye. I'm looking up. The psychology changes. Who the hell do you think you are? I created the environment in which you grew up. You should be appreciative.
Yeah, we let you make our
You
iPhones.
should take your space,
Yeah.
okay? Excuse me, our normal place is to be running the show, and your normal place is to take your seat at the table. So many people imagine that China would just follow the paths of Germany and Japan and take their place in the American-led international order. That was a pretty good idea, except they hadn't thought very carefully about history. Germany and Japan were defeated by the US in a war and occupied by the US. And then we wrote their constitution. And then we produced as a kind of training school. So China wants to be, this is Lee Kuan Yew's line, China wants to be respected as China, not as an honorary member of the West. Okay?
What happened in the late 90s, because it started with Clinton, where it seemed like a good idea to admit to the WTO, and then Bush kind of just, put the nail in the coffin and did it and actually supported it. We could have not supported it. Some people say it was a trade-off for China's support for the Iraq War. Who knows? But the point is, it happened. But I'm sure you guys were sitting in the engine room scenario planning what happens if this happens. And it's fair to say that from that context, we didn't necessarily get it right.
Right.
So what did you get wrong?
Well, again, it's good to go back to 2000 and just to remember, in 2000, China was somewhere between 5 and 10% of US's GDP. The people in 2000, 80% of the people in China were trying to live on $2 a day. So the place is a miserable, struggling mess. The US has been in the business ever since World War II of trying to encourage economic development in countries. So Clinton and Bush together, Clinton said about the WTO, it's a win-win-win situation. It's going to be a win for everybody. China is going to be lifted up. That's what we would like to do because people's lives will be better. And actually, there's been an anti-poverty miracle in China that as human beings, we have to admire. People that used to get a few calories now get enough calories to eat. That's got to be a good thing. The idea that this might work so successfully that China could become could come to have an economy as large as ours didn't occur to anybody at the time. You could see a few people as outliers, but that was just kind of not in the imagination. And then secondly, this was in a period of great hubris in the US. We had won the Cold War. We were living in this bubble, which the most famous thesis of the period was Frank Fukuyama's end of history. So everybody has become democracies and market economies. And if they have McDonald's, they can't have wars because people would prefer to get hamburgers than wars. Okay? You can hardly say that today without laughing, but that was sort of well-known, that was conventional wisdom at the time. So if you had come along and said, now, wait a minute, if China is very successful, it's going to come to have a GDP about the size of the U.S., and then it's going to have, back to your question, it's going to have its own aspirations. The Chinese have a view, understandably, and Ray talked about this earlier today. Sorry, for 4,000 or 5,000 years, they were the predominant power in all the world they knew. So their story is the normal conditions of things, is that we're at their Confucian. So hierarchy, harmony and peace comes through hierarchy. They're at the top of the hierarchy. That's the normal place. They were displaced from this by Westerners with technology 150 years ago. They call that the century of humiliation. And their aspiration is to go back to normal. And normal for them is China is the, quote, center of the universe. China is the sun around which the others, there's, you know, as you remember their thing about, you know, you can't have two tigers in the valley. There's the big one and the other one.
So I have two comments. The first is just a reaction to this. I'm sort of on the opposite side of you, which is that because of China's population woes and because of, I think, some of these technological things that are sort of on the horizon, I believe that we're sort of at the edge of an era of abundance that will create a massive peace dividend because a lot of the justifications for war go away. That's my personal view. But I have taken the time to try to steelman your point of view, which is we go to war. And the best steelman that I can come up with is very practical, so I'd like you to try to dismantle it, which is you have massive youth unemployment in China and waning growth. And so the simplest and most reductive way for China to basically grow and to appease 25% of young people, mostly men, from not uprising, is to essentially create demand. And the best way to create demand is to essentially create, a war machine. And that is why they go to war. Is that?
I would say I appreciate that option. I've worked very hard on the 12 scenarios for getting to war. If there's a war between the U.S. and China in the next year or 4 years or decade, how is it going to happen, in my view, the most likely? Not this way. It's going to happen the same way the last war happened. Now, if I would take a quiz here, since I know we live in the United States of amnesia, okay, when was the last war between the U.S. and China? I'm not going to give you a quiz, but I'll tell you the answer was 1950. What? Okay, and what happened? In 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea, almost pushed them off the whole peninsula. The U.S. had just won World War II. That's 5 years after the end of World War II. MacArthur and American troops were in Japan. They came to the rescue of South Korea. They pushed the North Koreans right back up the peninsula. And the 38th parallel, which had been the starting point, they pushed right across without even thinking, and were pushing right towards the Chinese border, the Yalu. Right. So you're now 1 year, this is 1950, 1 year after Mao has just won the Chinese Civil War. He hasn't even consolidated his position. The U.S. is Superman. We've just dropped 2 bombs next door in Japan in World War II, have a monopoly of nuclear power. The possibility that China would attack the U.S., it was unimaginable, certainly to MacArthur. But Mao, seeing the U.S. coming up to his border and not knowing wherever else he might stop, sent his peasant army to war with the U.S. and beat the Americans right back down the peninsula to the 38th parallel. So wars happen often not because anybody wants a war. At the beginning of 1950, if you'd gone to Mao and said, I got a good idea, once you go to a war with Superman, he would have said, right, you're out of your mind. If you'd gone to Truman in 1950, say, how about we have a war? Forget about it. But so you don't have to have an intention of either of the parties. I think the most likely way war will happen in the U.S. and China, something happens in Taiwan, either we're unduly provocative or the Taiwanese provocative.
I'm going to hand it to Sachs, but I want to just make one comment, get your reaction.
Yeah.
If that's the framing, what about India? Because now India is ascendant, it's got a growing population, it's got huge economic growth, and unlike China, who's not necessarily ever been subjugated in a war, the Indians have this memory of basically having Judeo-Christians that dominated that region,
right,
of which we all had to get liberty, which is almost even worse maybe. So just frame India in that context then.
Well, another great question, and again, nobody knows, but the Indian story, either theory one, India is about to become a serious rival to China. That's the fashionable story today. Theory two is India is the country of the future and will always be so. So we've been through already 5 of these cycles before where we declared India was about to rise rapidly, and lo and behold, India turns out to be India. So India has a lot of internal problems itself. As was mentioned earlier today, about 20% of the population are Muslims. Modi is basically undermining the multi-ethnic democracy that Nehru had built by getting support from the majority by oppressing the minority. So that's a complicated problem within, and a lot of other components. So if you look at the rivalry between the US and India in the 20th century and just graph it, you discover that lo and behold, in every year virtually, and every decade for sure, the gap between them has grown in China's favor. Now, not this year. India is growing much faster than China this year and last year and maybe next year, so we can look at the trajectories. I think it's quite possible, and I think the American strategy, which I think is the right one, is that this is a long-run game, a long game. So there's going to be a long rivalry between the US and China. We believe that a more liberty-centered, open, democratic political system will perform better over the long run than a party-led autocracy. Xi has a different idea. He says things are too chaotic, information is too uncertain. You can't let people just, my God, let people vote and look and see what happens in the US. Right. So we need to have order. And so our party-led autocracy, we believe is going to do, well, we play this out over time. If the US had to play this game only US versus China, I think we lose. But if the US plays this game with a group of allied and aligned, of whom we now see in the Quad, India and Australia and Japan, and then in AUKUS, we see Britain and Australia and the US, and in the trilateral that we just saw with Japan and South Korea. So you're seeing a configuration, I call it more guys on our side of the seesaw, and that can go over a long period of time, and it may turn out that democracies fail internally. I mean, I think it's a big challenge. I think there's no certainty about that. It may turn out that autocracies fail in the way autocracies have historically failed.
I think it's incredible framing because you have an autocracy in China and a democracy here, and then somewhat democratic is how we're, I think, describing India right now. Is India the most important relationship for America to get right at this moment in time? Is that the relationship we really need to be focusing on, since that seems like it's the linchpin or the fulcrum?
Well, I would say that's a good question, and I'm not sure. I am probably unduly skeptical about about India, because my impressions are overly shaped by Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew was the founder and builder of Singapore, and his great hope was for India, but ultimately he became to be despairing of its internal complexities. Modi seems to be a different character. If you looked at the way he ran the province that he had run before, or the state, he was very effective. He's very ambitious for India, so I'm hopeful about India. If India emerges, it has the potential, alongside, I don't think only India, Japan, South Korea, Australia,
New Zealand,
and even maybe the Europeans, again, depending on what happens here. So you could have a group of allied and aligned, not all agreeing on everything, but agreeing on enough that says we're trying the complex problem of governing a society, we believe has to start with the freedom and liberty of people. That's what we think is, and we think that's essential for the dynamism of innovation and invention. And lo and behold, there's a lot of evidence for that. And if we're the freest and most open society, lo and behold, a bunch of people come from other countries where they're not so free, and they do their thing here. I'd say thank God for that, okay? So under those circumstances, played out over a long run, you can imagine a story that turns out pretty well. In the case of the US and Soviet Union, just to remember, it's hard to believe, but if you go back and read your economic textbook that was published in the 1960s, Samuelson was the basically for economics. It says by the 70s, the Soviet Union will have overtaken the U.S. economy.
Right.
Yeah.
That was kind of a well-known
That
fact.
worked. Why didn't
Well,
that happen?
lo and behold, it didn't, okay?
Is the reason it didn't happen is because dictatorships have a hard time in the long term versus democracies?
Well, there's about 10 reasons why there's weaknesses in an autocracy. And you're now seeing a lot of evidence of it in the Chinese system, particularly after Xi became even more autocratic in guaranteeing his lease on life with the recent coronation, where he's got his third term, unprecedented, but without a term limit. So basically, if I'm the autocrat, and especially if I come to think as he does, he's got the thought of Xi Jinping, they write this into the Constitution. So this contains all wisdom. So one of the problems the guys are having with their AI machines is you can't ask a question that has an answer inconsistent with the thought of Xi Jinping that declares what's true about this and that.
Yeah.
So he doesn't opine much about mathematics or science, so you can ask those questions. Tencent's AI machine is a pretty good competitor for GPT-4 in the science or math. But if you ask a question about, how do freedom-centered societies perform, it can't answer that question because the thought of Xi Jinping says that
Does not compute.
one way is that. Another one, if you choose people for loyalty more than for competence, look at a company and see how that works. Okay, so 7 reasons, yes.
I think